We're going to continue our Lenten theme of how to make a good confession by continuing on with the Ten Commandments. We're down to our last four, and today I want to cover the sixth and the ninth commandment. The sixth commandment is this: thou shalt not commit adultery, and the ninth commandment is thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. The church generally addresses both of these commandments at once because they address the central topic of human sexuality, the human person. Obviously, in a church setting, there is only so much that is appropriate for me to talk about. On some topics, I'll have to be kind of general. If you want more details of how to examine your conscience, look at the Laudate app or the examination of conscience. It goes into very specific cases. And there might be things on there that you didn't even know were sins. If you have any questions on those sort of things, just ask your priest. That's what we're here for. I've found that after 14 years of being a priest, the subject of human sexuality is one that people question with and struggle with the most. When it comes to the human person, our bodies, and our sexuality, the church's view is completely foreign to that of the world in which we live. And so it would make sense for some people to not really see the value in what the church has to say regarding these issues. It's seen as old-fashioned or backwards or impractical or idealistic. But there are reasons the church teaches what it teaches on these things. 2,000 years of reasons, to be exact. 2,000 years of wisdom. So if you are completely or partially opposed to what the church teaches regarding one or more or all of these issues, all I ask is that you just listen to a different viewpoint than yours. I hope that I've proven over these last 7 years that my only desire is for your spiritual well-being and benefit. I don't think that I've led you astray, and I don't plan to do so in the future or now. I assure you that God loves you, that I love you, even if we disagree on some things. My goal here isn't to scold or judge anyone. I'm going to simply present what the church proposes and the reasons why it proposes those things. And if you want a more in-depth conversation about these, just ask. I'm more than willing to discuss these things that I can't necessarily speak of in detail from the pulpit. I'm not bashful about these things. I'll even get down to the biological details if you want me to. But you can just ask any of the couples that I've prepared for marriage. This teaching is challenging, but it's challenging in the best way. It may be difficult for some to hear, as much as it is for me to preach about. But every time I teach on these things, often the response that I get is, Father, I never even knew that. So let's learn together. Let's start with what Jesus says about the sixth commandment. He says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So much like he did last week with the fifth commandment and murder, Jesus expands the scope of the sixth commandment far beyond simply just not committing adultery. He says, anybody who looks at somebody with lust has already committed adultery. So we can start our examination of conscience there. Have I practiced the virtue of chastity? Have I looked at people the way that God sees them, or have I made somebody else the object of my own desire or lust? My best friend, Scott, he says that when you see a beautiful woman, you do three things. Number one, you don't pretend that she's not pretty, because that'll get you into trouble. Number two, you thank God for her beauty. And number three, you thank God for your vocation. And he did these three things the first time he met his wife. We were in the seminary together. And he thought that, he was supposed to be a priest, but he, one, recognized her beauty. He, two, thanked God for her beauty. And he, three, thanked God for his vocation, which at that time he thought was to be a priest. And God took care of the rest. Little did he know that in that moment that she would turn out to be his vocation. When we approach chastity from that sort of perspective, this is what is referred to as keeping custody of the eyes. And that means guarding ourselves from ourselves, essentially. Keeping distance from impure images or videos, avoiding situations that might lead us to impure images or videos, like being alone in front of a computer at night or in front of a smartphone or iPad. In my experience as a priest, this seems to be more of a temptation for us guys. This is kind of the way that God made us. We're attracted to beauty in all of its forms, but we tend to notice exterior beauty first. It's just the way God made us. But the devil knows that temptation of ours, and he created an entire adult film industry to exploit that temptation. And this sort of form of entertainment, I guess you could call it, is a mockery of human sexuality and chastity. It is a mockery of the intimacy of marriage. And it's especially abusive of women. If you ever read testimonies of women who have escaped the adult film industry, it's harmfully addictive, especially to boys. And studies show that prolonged viewing of pornography has the same effect on the male brain as cocaine does. And it basically rearranges our understanding of sexuality entirely. That warps it beyond anything that God had ever intended it to be. And thanks to things like social media, the average age of exposure to sexually explicit material is between the ages of 8 and 10. That's why I say keep the smartphones out of your children's possession as long as you possibly can. Fight that fight hard. Sociologists and psychologists have published entire research papers on how social media has been a cultural, mental, and emotional disaster, a psychological nightmare. And the trauma of seeing sexually explicit content at that young of an age can destroy your self-image and your view of the world. I now have parents who are bringing to me their preteen children who have decided they're trans or that they're gay. And that's what happens when you're exposed to such things at such an early age. It leads to confusion. It doesn't make sense. If girls aren't boy crazy by the age of 12 like all the rest of their classmates, well, then there must be something wrong with them. And so they go to a teacher or a counselor, and that teacher or counselor puts it in their head that they might be gay or trans or pansexual or asexual or whatever that means. And I've seen this exact scenario happen. And within months, this little girl was self-harming and contemplating suicide. And that wasn't in Lincoln or some East Coast or West Coast big city. That was here in Southwest Nebraska. The truth is that children shouldn't be boy crazy. They shouldn't even be thinking of these things quite yet. It's not normal, but it's all by design, a plan that the world has for your family. And it's a form of sexual abuse. In fact, when counseling people, which we do as priests with these sort of addictions, the playbook essentially is the same as addressing their issues as if they were sexually abused, because those are the symptoms that we see. Custody of the eyes includes what we watch on TV or in the movies. It extends to the music that we listen to, the jokes that we hear and tell. It also pertains to the clothes that we wear. What one person might think is comfy or cute can be the opposite of virtuous and modest. If we don't want to be seen as an object by somebody else, then we shouldn't present our bodies as a collection of objects, a collection of body parts. Just a few weeks ago on the high school retreat that I directed, some of the students basically made everybody uncomfortable by the clothes that they wore to the retreat because of how tight they were. And it essentially didn't leave much to the imagination of all the high school boys who were on the retreat. And it was a barrier for these girls to be seen as people rather than as objects of lust. And that's a tragedy that people think they have to do that. Or it's a tragedy that they don't even know that they're doing that to themselves. So that's sort of the overall vibe going into the 6th and 9th commandment. Believe it or not, 8 minutes and 30 seconds into the homily, that's just the introduction. The modern loss of sexual sacredness began with the introduction of artificial birth control. And I'm going to frame all of the remaining things that fall under the 6th and 9th commandment with that background, that backdrop of the church's teaching on contraception, because it's actually woven into everything. And if you think this is a ridiculous notion, I ask that you please be patient. Perhaps you will at least see why the church takes this kind of thing so seriously. And remember that I'm the messenger. I happen to completely believe in the message, but I'm the messenger nonetheless. I'm also a priest, which means I'm called to mercy and understanding, and that it's not my place to judge your soul, and I'm certainly not going to think bad of anybody because they struggle with something that the church teaches, or they might even struggle with a sin. That's not my job. My job is to heal. We all have our temptations and weaknesses. So if you disagree with what the church teaches, all I ask is that you simply listen. I have prepared every word of this homily, hours sitting in front of the Eucharist, praying right in front of the tabernacle, and the realization is that we're all at different points on our journey, and it takes a lot of faith and a lot of trust in God and to do what the church asks of us sometimes. And I know that all too well, trust me. I need that faith and that trust, so we can pray for that faith and that trust together. When it comes to this topic, we can turn to St. Paul VI. In 1968, he wrote the landmark encyclical Humanae Vitae, and in it, he made 4 predictions about the effects that the widespread use of contraceptives would have on society and on the world. These predictions turned out to be extremely prophetic, and it was sort of that wisdom that propelled him into becoming a saint. The first prediction that he made, he said that the use of artificial birth control would lead to widespread marital infidelity and a general lowering of moral standards. Within a decade of the FDA approving the pill, the divorce rate doubled from 25% to 50%, and it's remained there ever since. And one of the top reasons given for divorce is infidelity, adultery, cheating on your spouse, which is way easier with contraceptives. The reason that God takes the 6th commandment so seriously, thou shalt not commit adultery, is because marriage was the first sacrament he created. With the union of Adam and Eve, God showed us that faithful marriage and family is the most basic part of his plan. Falling under what St. Paul VI describes as a general lowering of moral standards is premarital sex. And there are several reasons why the church teaches against this. One of them is that being intimate outside of marriage, sort of practicing that kind of intimacy with somebody that you're not married to, makes it more tempting to do the same thing after marriage, to be intimate with somebody that you're not married to. And this intimacy doesn't have to be physical. It can be emotional as well. Marriage involves giving every aspect of your life to your spouse, not just the physical part. And that's why the church asks us to wait. And, the response is, well, Father, nobody does that anymore. But if you talk to couples that have, their relationship is a little bit different than everybody else's, at least I've noticed. Now, I'm not saying that in any way that it isn't possible for couples who didn't wait to have a good marriage. Obviously, that's not true. But why would we want to put more obstacles on our path to holiness as a married couple? The church also teaches against living together before marriage. And this is another way in which the moral culture has eroded since artificial birth control became widespread. And I know all the practical reasons why couples do this. It's cheaper. You get to know that person really well before you marry them. Sort of test drive the car, which is demeaning, I think, to relationships, but that's how people view it. And I also help people with their annulments after they get divorced. And in every annulment case that I've ever worked on, the couple was living together before marriage. It's not 98% or 99%, it's 100%. And this is true in my family. My siblings who are divorced are also the only siblings who live with their spouses before marriage. And it's probably true in your family. What I've noticed is that living together can be a huge pressure for people to get married when maybe they shouldn't. Living together can sort of accelerate that relationship with that person beyond what it was ever meant to be. And since they're already doing all the married things, what's the difference? We might as well get married. The difference is that marriage is a vocation. And that vocation not only needs to be discerned as a couple, you need to discern it as an individual. Is God calling me to marry this person? He might not be. Just because you really enjoy their company, or you really enjoy the practical aspects, or you really enjoy the physical intimacy with this person, it could still be possible that you were not called to marry them. And that's a lot easier to tell if you're not already living with that person, doing all the married things. Now, I'm not saying that every couple that lives together is bound to fail. If that were the case, the divorce rate would be 90%, not 50%. But what I'm saying is that it simulates marriage, which when you simulate a sacrament, that is a sin. But it also puts an additional barrier in our way when it comes to growing in personal holiness. And if the person that we're thinking about marrying is a barrier to our personal holiness, that's a bad way to start a life together, isn't it? The point of the sacrament of marriage is to get your spouse to heaven. And surely we can start early on that goal. After the introduction of oral contraceptives, the number of children born out of wedlock increased by an order of magnitude tenfold. Single motherhood is the number one cause of poverty in the United States, not medical bills, not unemployment, single motherhood. Almost immediately after the FDA approved oral contraceptives, abortion was legalized, and that was not an accident. Margaret Sanger, who is the founder of Planned Parenthood, which of course is the largest provider of abortions in the country, was a known Nazi sympathizer. I repeat, a Nazi sympathizer. And the original name for Planned Parenthood was the Contraception League. From its very beginning, abortion as an institution in the United States was viewed as a form of contraception. And from the very beginning, it was racist in nature. Margaret Sanger is famous for saying, there are not too many people in the world, there are too many of the wrong kind of people in the world. If you know your history, it can't be denied that contraception is fundamental to the abortion movement. In order for there to be unwanted babies, there needs to be physical relationships that produce unwanted babies. And contraceptives, well, you can't say unwanted baby more than that, right? According to Planned Parenthood's own research, 2 out of every 3 women that come to them for an abortion were on some form of contraceptive when they got pregnant. And when your entire business model stands to make unimaginable amounts of money almost entirely on abortion, you can bet that they're going to push contraceptives as much as possible. That's why they control the narrative. That's why they control the sex ed curriculum in our public schools. I can give an entire series of homilies on this topic alone. So that's the first prediction that St. Paul VI made. His second prediction was this: the widespread use of artificial birth control would lead to a loss of respect for women, where men would no longer care for her physical or psychological well-being. It turns out, when you take away the implications and the consequences of a physically intimate relationship by taking away the possibility of conception, that relationship is reduced to what is left, and that is a physical relationship with no need for permanence. The result in the last 70 years of women being viewed and used as objects for sexual pleasure is abundantly clear. The result is an enormous porn industry, sex trafficking on a scale that the world has never seen, record high levels of depression, anxiety, and suicide. The lack of care for women is apparent in our healthcare industry as well. Artificial birth control of varying strengths are prescribed for literally every single women's health issue, all the way from acne to endometriosis. The dark truth is that hormonal contraceptives are extremely dangerous to women's health. If it were a drug for any other use, it wouldn't have ever been approved by the FDA. It's so dangerous that most prescriptions come with the same warning as a carton of cigarettes. The side effects of hormonal contraceptives are basically a laundry list of the most prominent causes of death in women: heart disease, blood clots, stroke, breast cancer, osteoporosis. When the first version of the pill was being tested, 2 of the test subjects died from the test pill. They simply reduced the dosage and put it on the market. However, with this reduced potency, the drug companies had to work to actually make it effective at stopping a pregnancy. And I say stopping a pregnancy, not preventing a pregnancy, is because in many oral contraceptives, there's a mechanism built into it that if conception does in fact take place, it essentially causes a miscarriage so early in the actual achieved pregnancy that it goes unnoticed. So this means that the pill not only acts as a contraceptive, but it also has a mechanism in it that is called an abortifacient drug. Abortifacient is a term that comes from the Latin, which literally means to make abortions. And you can see why this was all part of Margaret Sanger's plan. St. Paul VI's third prediction was that the widespread use of artificial birth control would lead to an abuse of power by government authorities, placing family values in the hands of the state. Have you ever wondered to yourself, why have sexual issues like abortion and gender become political issues? You'd think that the two wouldn't go together. It's because there's people in this world at the highest levels of government who want to control your family because they stand to make a lot of money off of that. I said this a couple weeks ago, if they can reshape the human family to break families apart, it costs a lot more money for those families. And people stand to make a lot of money off of broken families because, broken families need 2 of everything. If you look at the countries with the most authoritarian of governments, China, North Korea, they aim to control the family first. St. Paul VI's fourth prediction is that the widespread use of artificial birth control would lead to unlimited scientific dominion over the human body. And this is an overall attitude shift that we've seen in the last 70 years. What's the very first pro-abortion argument? They say, it's my body, I can do what I want with it. And what this has led to is basically treating the human person like it's a science experiment. We have in vitro fertilization and surrogate motherhood. And 2 entire generations have sterilized, aborted, and contraceptive themselves into irrelevance. During the COVID lockdown, the population of the United States went down for the first time in history. And the reason for that is because during COVID, there was no immigration. We don't have enough babies to replace our own population. We rely on other countries for that now. And we all complain about it. We watch the news. The mindset of science over the dignity of the human person has led to a near 0% birth rate for children with Down syndrome. The abortion rate for unborn children with detective Down syndrome in the United States is 95%. And in places like Sweden, the Down syndrome birth rate is 0 because it's required to have an abortion by law. So those are the 4 predictions that St. Paul VI made in 1968. And it didn't take very long for basically all of them to come true. We made very, very quick work of that. I want us to think of human life on the most fundamental of levels. Since the beginning of the universe, talking like science here now, there has actually been nothing new created. The atoms that make up your body are the same atoms that were sent into our solar system by an exploding star 4 billion years ago. Everything in the observable universe is simply the recycling and rearranging of the same matter. So what that means is that the only truly new thing that has ever come into existence since the beginning of the universe is the human soul, because that's not made of matter. It is immaterial, it's spiritual. And God gives human beings the power to create something new. The same level, the same type of creation as let there be light is in our hands. And when we cooperate with that, a human soul that is unique, unrepeatable, and eternal comes into existence. That's an incredible power, an incredible gift. Such an incredible gift that God had to invent marriage to make that gift work. So to say no to that gift is a serious thing. What does it say about us when we cut God out of the most intimate part of our marriage? It could be a sign that our trust in Him might not be what we think it is. I have a story about this very thing from my own family. My parents are going to be here tomorrow morning, so I hope I get the details right. But when my mother was pregnant with my brother John, there were complications that required surgery while he was still in utero. It was a scary thing. It was a serious thing. Serious enough that Mom and Dad perhaps considered that it was a sign that maybe God was telling them that they were done having any more children. Later on, after that event, Dad went on a men's retreat, and he came back from that time of prayer, that time alone with God, and he told my mother, Lori, it's my mother's name, I think God wants us to have another baby. And my mother told him, you know what? You're crazy. My mom then went on a women's retreat, and after a time of prayer alone with God, she came to the same conclusion. You're right. I think God wants us to have another baby. And my sister Mary is the result. It's a beautiful story of how 2 people cooperated with God's plan. They asked Him first, not their own will. They turned the most intimate part of their marriage into a prayer. They made the most intimate part of their marriage into the most intimate part of their relationship with God. And I can say with absolute certainty, I know that if Mary had not been born, I would not be a priest. She played that big of a role in my life. And only God knows the effect that one priest can have on the world. And I leave no earthly legacy. Think of every married couple. My grandparents were open to life. My dad's parents were so open to life that they adopted him. My mother's parents were so open to life that they had 8 children. The 8th one is my mother. What if they had stopped? And each of their children will go on to have hundreds of descendants. From My two grandparents, those two couples, over 200 direct descendants. And who knows how many priests will be among those 200. Think of all the times that we've said no to God, to any part of his plan, not just the number of kids that we have, but any part of his plan where we say no to him has ripple effects for the rest of time. It has an impact that only God knows the answer to. Obviously, there's people who can't have children, and there are people who have had to have medical procedures like, hysterectomies for health reasons. If your doctor has told you that a pregnancy would risk your life, certainly take that to prayer. And if you need spiritual advice or assurance, talk to your priest. It may be God's way of, in fact, telling you that you've had your last baby. And you may have heard the statistics out there. Hardly anybody follows the church's teaching on these things. But there's another statistic. In the United States, 50% of all marriages end in divorce. And couples that do not practice natural family planning fall right in line, 50%. No matter the race, skin color, tax bracket, Catholic, Muslim, Jew, atheist, 50% of all marriages end in divorce. But for couples that practice what the church teaches in regards to natural family planning and follows the church's teaching on marriage, the divorce rate is 5%. 10 times the chance of a successful marriage. Who wouldn't want to take those odds? But I know how difficult it is. Like I said at the beginning, I'm not here to scold anyone. I'm here to present what the church proposes, and I invite you to pray about it. It's okay if it's something that you wrestle with, because God can handle that. And God has a plan for you that is better than any of us could possibly know.